I don't really have an answer to that. Last thing I want to do is go back to this slide where we have our individual sampling points, and I want to pull out some comparisons to show you something else that we saw. So these 2 points are on the same farm, same field, same exact sample date, everything. What do you suppose might be the difference between this one that's 3,381 parts per billion and this one that's 346? Right, so Doug here said this one was our fescue only sampling. This one was our grab sample where we took, whatever was there as we moved along. So this doesn't even include any clover. This is just, some fescue. There might have been some orchard grass, bluegrass in there, and it's a pretty big difference, and it shows what the effect of dilution can be on toxicity of a pasture. And another point I'd like to make, kind of going back to that McCormick farm, remember that was, again, it was droughty, but it was tracking kind of low, relatively. If you have a pasture that might be here, say, running 2,000–3,000 parts per billion throughout the season, and that's our fescue-only pasture, our monoculture, if you have something that has some clover or some other grasses in it, you might be running like this. And then there's different fluctuations that before I said weren't that important. They become, I think, the times when we see problems is when we get spikes that take us above threshold. Now, I think Jay's going to maybe say a little bit later that there is no safe threshold, and certainly he's well versed on that, and we'll hear about that. But there is this difference that we see from dilution, and that's a good tool in my mind, good practical tool to combat the problem. Here's another pasture. This one is 1789 parts per billion. This one's 418. This is a field that he cut for hay, and this is the sample taken fescue only the day before he cut, and then this is the hay sample that I took in September. So again, it shows you, one, what the power of dilution can do for you, because this had a little bit of orchard grass in with it. And then the other thing it shows you is that we can test hay, and we don't want to ignore hay, because we could potentially take a hay that might be very low in toxicity and use that in some way to help with the total system. If we're looking at the McCormick farm and we might see some really high alkaloid stockpiled fescue in the fall, could we feed some hay that might be low in toxicity for a couple weeks to get us through until things frost and that plant's not actively growing as much? The last thing I want to show you is this sample right here. It reads 150 parts per billion. There's actually a cluster of 4 or 5 here that we sampled. You can't see them because it's hidden, but they all came back about 150, 125, somewhere around that. And those were max Q samples. And I trust that there's actually no alkaloid production in those max Q samples. This was probably some wild toxic fescue coming back in the pasture, or maybe some sampling error. But what this shows us is that the max Q and those novel endophyte fescues do what they say they're doing. It's just a little, backs us up a little bit on that. So our last conclusion that we kind of drew is that pasture diversity is a very good tool for combating fescue toxicity. In summary, what have we learned from one season of doing this alkaloid testing? One, we have the potential for alkaloid levels that are far above any threshold that you would draw, whether that's 0 or 500. We've got some pretty hot stuff out there. There can also be large differences between farms and fields, and that's due to 500 different factors that are pretty difficult to tease apart. We also it was really evident to us that seasonal fluctuations mirror plant growth. So whenever we saw vigorously growing plants, due to rain and the right temperatures and nitrogen, we saw very high alkaloid levels. And that's all just one piece of the puzzle. You look at the toxicity of a pasture, and that alone will not likely cause toxicosis problems. There's also, what's the environment? Is it hot enough to cause those summer syndrome problems? Is it cold enough to cause fescue foot problems? And then also, what's the animal response? So there's a lot of things that have to come together to cause a toxicosis issue. And I think that's why, when I said if I would poll everybody, you see a lot of variability. Some folks think they have problems, some say they don't. It's not going to be every year. And I think that's why we see that, is there's so many factors that have to come together to kind of create the perfect storm.